In my previous video about using your glucose meter to beat diabetes, I recorded just too much footage, and so I had to save some of it for later. Today is that day, and we're going to see that it is when you test your glucose frequently, you will soon give up on all the advice you've heard about the necessity to eat lots and lots of carbs. And I'll also share with you a way you can quickly find out your A1C without even going to the lab or even buying an A1C home testing kit. A couple of years ago, Benedict and I went to a Japanese restaurant at a mall 2 days in a row. Both days we ordered chicken teriyaki. The first day we had the chicken over a bed of rice and then tested our glucose about an hour afterwards. The second day we ordered our chicken teriyaki over a bed of lettuce and vegetables and then again tested our glucose about an hour after eating. Testing 1 hour after finishing each meal, I rose to 155 on the first day, eating only about half the rice they gave me. The second day, eating the chicken over veggies, at 1 hour after eating, I rose to only 105. Mike, the meter, was speaking loudly with these two tests, and what he was saying was that the rice was raising my blood sugar unacceptably high, but the vegetables were no problem at all. And this is just an example of how we can use our blood sugar meters to craft for ourselves a non-spiking, non-diabetic diet. The truth is this: a diabetic, if he or she wants to become a non-diabetic, is going to have to make some changes in his or her diet. They cannot keep on eating the way they did before. But we're going to need a nutritionist or a dietitian to tell us what foods and meals are safe to eat and what foods and meals are strictly out of bounds. The good news is that Mike the Meter is the best dietitian in the world, and he comes cheap. If we'll test our blood sugar and determine how badly various foods affect us, we'll soon be able to craft a diet that works for us. And what 99.9% of diabetics will discover is that it is the starches and the sugars, in other words, the carbohydrates, that raise our blood sugar, and it is the proteins and the fats that have a minimal effect on our blood sugar. And as we move toward replacing all those junk carbs and the starches with healthy fats and proteins, Mike the Meter will assure us we're on the right track as we watch our spikes as well as our fasting blood sugar dropping down, down, down. When I posted that teriyaki test originally, I had one person leave a comment under the video that seemed to sort of mock me for the simplicity of the test. He wrote something like this: so you eat rice and chicken one day and your blood sugar goes up, and then the next day you eat chicken with vegetables and your blood sugar stays low? Is that the lesson, or am I missing something? Well, that individual seemed to be saying, we all know this, Dennis. This is hardly revolutionary. Well, he's partly right and partly wrong. Those of us who test our blood sugar a lot do know this, and it's hardly major news. But for the new diabetic who's completely ignorant of almost everything related to blood sugar, this is a tremendous insight and revelation. When I was first struggling with high surges of glucose, I wish I could have seen that video. It would have saved me a lot of worry and confusion. Well, there are two almost opposite approaches that are preached to diabetics as the proper way to beat diabetes. One, of course, is what I preach, which is eating a low-carb, high-fat, or high-protein diet, along with time-restricted eating. The other approach is the high-carb, plant-based diet. Both groups are highly vocal about the superiority of their method, and they can both offer cases of individuals who brought their A1Cs down close to the normal range by following their particular guidelines. Actually, I started out in the other camp when I was searching for a way to overcome my terrible blood sugar fluctuations. I read that a vegetarian diet is the answer, and I tried that. Of course, I was eating a high-carb vegetarian diet, and I didn't stay with it very long, maybe 2 or 3 months. So why did I scrap that approach so quickly? I gave it up because I started testing my post-meal glucose about an hour after eating with my blood sugar meter. And when I ate high-carb vegetarian meals, my glucose was off to the races. It was depressing to see. Time after time, meal after meal, my glucose was soaring to 180, 200, 220, about an hour after I finished that plant-based high-carb meal. And to make matters worse, after a few hours, my blood sugar came crashing down oftentimes, sometimes into the 50s or 40s, making me feel completely miserable and like I was about ready to pass out. But when I switched and ate a low-carb meal, eating as much meat as I liked, I found my glucose just rose a small amount and then gently came back down. I had completely stable blood sugar. Now, how did I figure that out? I tested my glucose after my meals. And let me say it again slowly so you really get it. I tested my glucose after my meals. And you know what? As I have read the experiences of others, I came to realize that virtually everybody who frequently tests their blood sugar comes to the same conclusions I did. They start leaning hard into a low-carb way of eating. As I read some of the things the high-carb promoters had to say, such as meat and saturated fat cause diabetes, and they cause insulin resistance, they cause this, they cause that, you know what I found? I found that the high-carb promoters and gurus almost never encourage anyone to test their glucose levels. And some of them actually discourage diabetics from testing their glucose. Well, why would they do that? The reason's pretty simple. They know if you start doing some serious testing, you'll find your blood sugars are soaring after eating those high-carb meals, which is pretty depressing, and it might cause you to become disenchanted with your plant-based high-carb diet. You might end up deserting the cause and going over to the enemy. Now, if you ever challenge these non-testing folks, they'll tell you spikes really don't matter. No matter how high you go, you'll soon come down and you'll not stay in that upper range too long. Well, I'll admit in some cases that may be true, although typically the older you get, the longer you'll stay in dangerous territory. But major glucose spikes are not irrelevant, as some folks would suggest. They're almost always associated with major insulin spikes, and they spell trouble. And I find that if I ever read an article or a book or see a video about conquering diabetes that features the heavy use of post-meal glucose testing, almost always these folks will be in the low-carb camp. The way high-carb meals and food spike blood sugar, it could hardly be otherwise. Now, there is a phrase that is used for people who craft their diet according to the results they get from post-meal testing, forsaking foods that raise their glucose unacceptably high. And the phrase used for this kind of an approach is eating to the meter. You are shaping your diet by what pleases your glucose meter, and you're eliminating any and every food that offends your meter and makes your blood sugar levels unacceptably high. The beauty of this simple system is it just flat works. High glucose levels go down in a dramatic fashion, as well as high insulin levels, or the need to ingest excessive amounts of insulin. Excess weight comes off, triglycerides drop dramatically, and many will likely no longer need to take their blood pressure medication. Diabetic complications begin to recede, energy returns, and instead of scolding you, your doctor might look at you with wide eyes and ask, "What in the world have you been doing?" And most doctors, if they have any sense, will tell you, well, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. And you may find yourself asking this, if something this simple works this well, why doesn't the whole world know about it? There is one further thing we can do with Mike the Meter. We can determine our A1c. Now you say, wait a minute, Mike doesn't give us an A1c score. No, he does not. But we can take 5 or 6 glucose tests over a 24-hour period, find the mathematical average, and then plug it into a converter and get a pretty fair representation of our A1c if we continue to eat the way we did that day and get the same glucose measurements. This week I did just that. I tested my glucose 6 times over a 24-hour period. I mixed it up, testing it 1 hour after a meal, 2 hours after a meal, upon awaking, shortly before bed, and a couple of other times. My numbers were these: 96, 90, 87, 101, 100, and 88. I added these numbers together, and the total was 562. I divided 562 by 6 to get my EAG, my estimated average glucose. That average was 93.66 and a never-ending number of sixes. I rounded that number to 93.7 and put it into an online converter, and it gave me an A1c of 4.9. Now, that does not mean that if you do this, you can go to the lab tomorrow and get the exact same number. If your glucose has been dropping, it will take a while, about 3 or 4 months, for your A1c to catch up with your current glucose levels. But by converting your average glucose levels to an A1c, what it means is if you continue to register numbers like those and levels like those, in about 3 months your A1c should be just what the formula gave you, in my case a 4.9. One further time you can test your glucose is from 3 to 4 hours after eating, maybe at 10:30 at night or at noon before you eat your midday meal. Now, what purpose is that? Well, that number will tell you if you're dropping down to your base level after 3 or 4 hours. If after 3 hours your number is still well above your fasting glucose or your baseline level, it means your body is taking too long to process that last meal, which means you might need to reconsider whether that meal is worth keeping in your diet. Now, if you're just getting started in your diabetic journey and you wake up in the morning with fasting glucose in the 200s or 300s or 400s, well, there's no way you can expect to get your levels below 140 or even 200 an hour after you eat. After all, you're going to be at those numbers or higher before you ever take a bite. But those post-meal numbers and tests are still incredibly valuable. You can compare where you land after eating a mac and cheese casserole with how high you jump after eating a roasted chicken and green beans. Even though in both cases the numbers may be high, the mac and cheese meal will produce glucose levels way above the chicken and green beans meal. And as you see those numbers and compile all the dietary data that you're accumulating, you'll not only get smarter and eat smarter, you'll have no more problems with a lack of motivation. In fact, I would say, Mike, your blood sugar meter is a motivational specialist. Unmotivated diabetics, well, they are diabetics who rarely test themselves, and usually they never test themselves post-meal. It would be very difficult to constantly test your glucose and stay unmotivated. In fact, I think it would be almost impossible. So there you have it. Your little glucose meter is a powerful ally in your fight against diabetes. Learn to use it. Learn to love it. You'll thank me later. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.